running the Badlands. Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for all of those watching. Today is the centennial episode, the 100th episode of Breaking History, and I'm glad that we can share this together. This is a big milestone, and unfortunately, I wish it was occurring in more celebratory times, but unfortunately, that was, I guess, the purpose why this show was created in the first place, was to bring about a better understanding of the context and the contours of the traps of the crisis that we're currently living through, in order to better navigate and problem solve with a better understanding of the past, the dynamics, the bad ideas, the sick ideas, the foolish ideas that got us into these periodic messes as a civilization, while at the same time looking to the future with the best possible information and an understanding of the nature of the enemy humanly possible. So, today, we have a lot to go through, but not too much time to go through it. So there's going to be a lot of big ideas, and unfortunately, Gordon could not make it due to certain family arrangements. So we're going to be running the ship solo. And as many of you know, what I like to do when I'm doing one of these shows by myself is to take a little bit more of a classroom style approach. So if you are in a position to do so, I would suggest ideally pulling out maybe a notebook or two. If not, just go to the links in the description box once this is uploaded, and there's going to be some resources that I'll make available to add a little bit of coloring to what we're going to go through today. But before we do anything of the sort, I'd like to begin with a word from today's primary sponsor, Goldco, which will launch right now. Have you heard about President Trump's impact on gold? Every time Trump's name surges in the headlines, gold goes with it. It happened the day he took office, and it's still going up. Gold doesn't just like Trump, it rallies around him. If you bought gold the day he became president, you'd be up almost $400 an ounce by now. Here's the thing. Gold has been used as a store for value for centuries. The government can't easily manipulate it, and it's known as a hedge against market risk and inflation. How high will the price of gold go under Trump's second term? Will gold continue to break record after record in 2025 and beyond? Learn about an IRS loophole that allows you to diversify your savings with gold and silver tax and penalty-free, with a free copy of Gold and Silver Kit sent directly to your doorstep. Plus, you could qualify for up to a 10% instant match in bonus silver. Visit badlandsgold.com to learn how you can add gold to your portfolio. Okay. So, without further ado, I guess what I will begin with today, I mean, everyone, I think, watching is pretty familiar with the color revolutionary efforts currently underway to destabilize the United States at a time of existential crisis and choice. There's also hanging over the head of the fires, the arson-induced fires, literal and otherwise. There are actual fires also in California as we speak, which may or may not have arson associated with them. We know that there's a lot of evidence of human involvement with past California, as well as Canadian and northeastern so-called wildfires that have less to do with climate change and much more to do with human agency. So that's a factor in play. But we also have more metaphorical arsonists as well, lighting fires of social chaos. So we're going to go through some of that, and we're going to also take a step back, both geographically speaking, because there's space and time. Those two aspects work together for context. In the spatial aspect, it will be used to better appreciate the techniques being deployed currently inside of first California, but then more potentially the US as a whole, followed by what traps not to fall for, looking at other governments that have been faced with these sorts of choices run by certain nefarious agencies associated with such institutions as the Central Intelligence Agency, MI6, and their civilian cover organizations. Here we're going to be speaking about George Soros's Open Society Foundation, as well as the National Endowment for Democracy, to name but a few, but important ones. So we'll do that spatially, but then we'll also look at a particular case study of the first attempt by a foreign agency to induce the US to cannibalize itself into civil war back in the 19th century. So that'll be an interesting way to round out today's presentation. So before we go into that, though, let's look at today's situation. I chose to call today's episode Civil Wars as Divide to Conquer Strategies. And indeed, more often than not, when you scratch behind the surface of a lot of the civil wars throughout history, whether it's the Roman Civil War that saw the collapse of the Roman Republic into chaos, out of which emerged a new system of empire under the god-man figure of Emperor Octavian Augustus, the nephew of Julius Caesar, who came out victorious in the war, the long civil war against Mark Antony and Cleopatra, which itself had a number of mystery cults associated with that entire civil war from above, occultists galore. And I think at that time you'll find that this was not a naturally occurring development. This was something that was artificially induced by occultists that manage what is actually at the heart of the international deep state, both today and in the past. But also when you look at things like the civil war between Protestants and Catholic people in the 17th century, known as the 30 Years' War, that's another case where we find that the 30 Years' War had less to do with an organic bloodletting of millions of dead over the course of 30 years of religious war, as we've often been told, but had a lot more to do with Rosicrucian manipulations by the followers of people like John Dee, Michael Meyer, the Phoenixing alchemist, who was also very closely associated with people like Robert Flood, Francis Bacon, and the entire founding groupings that set up the Invisible College system that had orchestrated. And there's actually a pretty good book called The Rosicrucian Enlightenment by herself an occultist academic named Frances Yates, which I'm nearly finished with, that does get across this case pretty well, although she's in favor of the Rosicrucians. I much less so, but I think the evidence is presented pretty well for an inquiring mind to realize that occult forces once again were behind the burning of Europe, with the idea of creating a new type of humanity, a new type of society in their more preferred image. That didn't work out. But again, we saw its influence in the British Civil War, in England in the 1640s and 50s, which again had major Rosicrucian occult influences manipulating it. And as we will see again later on today, the American Civil War. I'll add in the French Civil War of the 1790s as well, which saw the hopes of Benjamin Franklin and his allies for Republican France go up in flames in the years of the bloody terror of mass bloodletting, which itself had Freemasonic, Martinist, and other Freemasonic influences that were managing that shit show, turning it into a complete disaster for humanity, which could only be filled by another godman type of complex, as in Napoleon was, who declared himself the new emperor of the world in 1800, and which did a lot of damage to humanity as a whole, which I don't think even the French have recovered from, even to this very day. So all that to say, today we're living in history. The Civil War thing, it is part of a strategy of divide to conquer. It's easier to rule a divided people than a people who are united, even if they have different religious qualities or different linguistic or ethnic qualities. Of people who find their common humanity as primary and work together for the benefit of their kids are always much more difficult to conquer. They're much more difficult to make stupid, to cut off from their better noble moral traditions than a society which becomes tribal, parochial, detached from their past or their future, and much more prejudiced and bigoted to those who might sound different or look different from them. So these are little warning signs that I'm just throwing out there for people who failed the test. Now, to recap last week, I'm glad that we did what we did last week. It was the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square so-called massacre. And I think Gordon and I did a pretty fair job at evaluating the actual data and evidence demonstrating that what was known as the Tiananmen Square massacre is largely a mythology cooked up many years after the fact, and that event on June 4th, 1989 in Beijing was more of a Soros CIA-funded color revolution. We went through many of the players that were tied directly to the CIA, to George Soros's Open Society Foundation, to the National Endowment for Democracy, who were on the ground organizing in the years, the months, and the weeks prior to the development of that uprising. That had less to do with students in Tiananmen Square and actually much more to do with events occurring half a mile away, which involved agents provocateurs, much like we saw in the French or the Bolshevik revolutions, carrying out bloodletting, killing both protesters as well as soldiers, lighting many soldiers on fire alive. And we saw some gruesome images of that. And one of the key figures in that story, who we see there in the photograph there on the slide, next to Ronald Reagan, is none other than Zhao Ziyang, who is George Soros's CCP puppet, or CPC puppet. He was known as the Gorbachev of China in the popular press. And Zhao Ziyang was somebody who, with his lieutenant Chen Yitzi, co-ran a think tank called the Society for the Reform and Opening Up of China to massively liberalize and globalize the Chinese economy in the 1980s, funded by George Soros. So we went through a lot of that, and how the plan was at the time for this particular figure to become, in this piece of kabuki theater, the man of the people who would stand up against the totalitarian evil government and be propelled into a position of undisputed power, kind of like what Trotsky had been attempting to do as the preferred Wall Street, London golden boy of the 1920s Russia. That was the attempt that was also made for Zhao Ziyang. Now that failed. We saw very briefly in the course of last week's presentation, which again, I suggest people review to get more details, but that's in episode 99, a quote that inaugurated the National Endowment for Democracy. This quote was by Samuel P. Huntington, himself employed by Zbigniew Brzezinski under the Trilateral Commission project in Kyoto, Japan, called the Task Force on the Governability of Democracies in 1975, where Samuel P. Huntington had said, one might consider means of securing support and resources from foundations, business corporations, labor unions, political parties, civic associations, and where possible and appropriate, governmental agencies for the creation of an institute for the strengthening of democratic institutions. He's referring here to the fact that the CIA itself was caught red-handed inflaming protest movements around the world in order to regime change governments that we didn't like, as well as just outright assassinate different leaders democratically elected in various governments who were a threat to this idea of Anglo-American hegemony. It had gone, a lot of this went public with the Church Committee hearings in 1975 that unveiled things like MKUltra, broader abuses of the CIA. And so Huntington, Zbigniew, and others were, basically they assigned themselves the task of rebranding those functions under a more civilian garb. We know that Karl Gershman, who became the head of the National Endowment for Democracy, had said in the late 80s, quote, "It would be terrible for democratic groups around the world to be seen as subsidized by the CIA. We saw that in the 1960s, and that is why it has been discontinued." We also saw Gershman's associate, whose name I'm forgetting, assert that pretty much everything that the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, does today, and this is in 1992, was done covertly by the CIA 20 years earlier. Actually, I have that quote here. That's David Ignatius saying that in 1991, a lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. Now, just to get across, in the years following 1975, you had several entities created, overseen by the Trilateral Commission to fulfill the tasks set forth by Huntington and Zbigniew. Number one was the American Freedom Foundation. In 1979, we had also that same year, the Open Society Foundation was created by George Soros. Keep in mind here, George Soros had earlier become a very influential currency speculator, having created the world's first modern hedge fund to be devoted principally to speculation and speculation against currencies, most specifically as their specialty, in 1968. And that quantum hedge fund was made possible by seed capital from none other than Evelyn de Rothschild. So Soros, despite having been celebrated as the guy who broke the British pound in 1991, is actually a British imperial stooge. And that breaking of the British pound by speculating against the British pound during the time when the Maastricht Treaty was being set forth and coming online, 1991, 1992, gave the excuse to the UK government to say, well, we have so much chaos going on inside of our own country right now that we couldn't possibly get into the European Union, the Eurozone, and the euro itself, as we ourselves had orchestrated it originally for all of the other members of Europe to go into. So that provided a nice excuse to say, oh, we'll get into it later. Thank you. But we have to take care of this mess that George Soros put on our table. So we're just going to keep our local national currency for now, and we'll join you later on, we promise. Now, I hope everybody sees how that trap worked and how Soros was actually working for the interests of the British at that time. Now, the Open Society Foundation was a philanthropic organization that was created at this moment, I don't think as a coincidence, to advance exactly what Samuel P. Huntington called for as civilian philanthropic front group agencies that would advance democracy-building organizations that would usually result in citizens' movements for human rights, other things that would encourage civil disobedience and ultimately the toppling of governments that we don't like in countries either deemed authoritarian or democratic. Who cares if those countries are standing in the way of global empire? So this goes on. 1983, the National Endowment for Democracy Act is passed with $31 million of funding via the AFL-CIO Free Trade Union Institute, as well as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Center for Private Enterprise, the International Republican Institute, and the International Democratic Institute, as well as Freedom House, which itself is connected to Soros on a number of levels. Yeah, let's just leave it at that for now. And as we also saw that the script, the playbook that was used to train democracy movement, mostly youth, but people of all ages, but mostly youth, lawyers, people even affiliated with missionary activities, with nominally church activities in various governments, would be given training in different impact workshop centers overseen by the NED, the CIA. And specifically this figure whose creepy look we were introduced to last week with a documentary called How to Start a Revolution, introducing Gene Sharp, who himself was a devotee of Henry Kissinger. He ran the Albert Einstein Institute at the Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. Still to this day, I think this is one of the most instrumental agencies at overseeing regime change operations abroad and maybe at home as well. That somebody should pull on that thread. But most importantly, this was the outgrowth of the Office of the Chief of Psychological Warfare and Special Operations Office from the CIA, and its founders included both Kissinger, George Bundy, James Perkins, Robert Bowie, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Samuel Huntington, and Dean Rusk. So this was an agency that was very active in China, Tiananmen Square. Gene Sharp had even written about his own 9-day involvement at Tiananmen Square during the buildup to the violent breakout on June 4th, 1989. A number of other people were also involved directly. James Lilly, a high-level CIA figure who was doubling as U.S. ambassador at the time, and many others. So let's now skip over to the present. So that was just a little recap of what we did in summary form last week, because it's come home to roost. It's come home to roost. What we have there is a Daily Mail coverage of a new Canadian report, which was calling for a warning, basically a gaming out of a scenario of a civil war in America after the US elections. And this is June 12th, 2024, that this article was published. And indeed, what this Daily Mail report is covering is something that is featured in some detail in the 2024 report from Policy Horizons Canada. That's the photo of the cover of it, called Disruptions 2024, funded entirely by the Canadian government. It's a branch, it's a certain think tank, kind of like a Rand Corps thing in Canada, of which it featured a number of major chaos scenarios to look forward to, of which U.S. Civil War danger was prominently featured on that list under the Geopolitics section. Ironically, featured under Billionaires Run the World, which I don't know what the authors of this report were thinking, since billionaires already do run the world. That's not a threat. That's a thing. Canadian national unity unravels, again, June 2024. Which plays directly into some things that are now happening clearly in Canada, with major separatist movements naturally emerging, as one should have expected, due to the institution of Mark Carney, who's committed to a certain doctrine of empire, which is reprehensible in the minds and morals of many Canadians, and especially those Canadians in Alberta and on the West Coast. But they say here on that point, I'll just do a little segue. The sense of a shared identity and common purpose that has underpinned Canadian unity is eroding dramatically. Separatist movements operate in some provinces and territories. People feel disconnected from Canada, its culture, values, climate goals, and economic priorities. Yep, no shit. So that's one thing. Civil war erupts in the United States. U.S. ideological divisions, democratic erosion, and domestic unrest escalate, plunging the country into civil war. Yeah, we can see that that's been gamed out. It has been strangely fluid, right? The transition from Biden to Trump 2.0. I was a bit surprised how soft and overly suspiciously easy that transition was over the first couple of months. But I think that a lot has been baked in and been planned in a very nasty way. So I don't have all of those details. We're just going to look at some circumstantial evidence that we can take to the bank and adduce our own hypotheses about what this is, how it works, what its pedigree is, and then how to navigate this thing. Again, that'll just feature the last on the list of policy horizons dangers is cyber attacks, disable critical infrastructure. Interruptions to essential services such as the internet, electricity, transportation, water, and food supply systems are common due to regular cyber attacks disrupting everyday life. We've seen enough of the cyber polygon, World Economic Forum, war game scenarios to know that that's also something which has been thought and gamed out. So I don't want to be a disaster monger, but it's a fact. You do have to think like the sociopaths trying to play us like a video game in order to get a better appreciation of the types of dangers that have been thought about by those who are humanity's enemies. And they do think about this, whether that's a false flag or what have you. I think that would be likely. It would take place as a false flag operation that would maybe be blamed on one of the enemy nations of those influences who are currently trying to manage the transatlantic system, possibly Iran, possibly China, possibly Russia, maybe some combination of all three. We know that Alex Karp, the vice president of Palantir, had said only about 9 months ago that he believes and even desires the outcome that in a very short time, the U.S. should expect to go to war with a combination of Russia, China, and Iran. And he's not a small-time player. That's Alex Karp, right? He's significantly influential. So I don't think he's just speaking in a vacuum. We know in the case, and I won't belabor this, since I think every viewer here is already pretty familiar and is following this pretty closely, but, we do know that there are some suspicious elements, though I don't have any direct National Endowment for Democracy funding to, or even, there are secondary ties to, from Soros's operations to many of the things that are happening with the very violent very organized protests in California, but we know that there are some very suspicious things, like the fact that Gavin Newsom is good friends with both Soros and Soros's son, featured there in the photograph. We know that also there were strange advertisements all over Craigslist in the weeks and months leading up to this, offering qualified volunteers who are, quote, described as tough, badass people in LA, $6,500 to $12,500 per week. This advertisement literally said, well, I mean, it's basically offering a ton of money for people who will get paid even if an activity has not been launched, and they just simply have to have the strength of mind to be tough and to follow orders and to just basically run into whatever chaos is thrown at them. Actually, you know what I'll do? I'm going to show a little video here. I don't think, since we're not streaming on YouTube right now, I think there was a strike. I would like to play a little video just to get across. You know, I showcased what was being discussed by the Canadian think tank scene. There is a particular video as well that falls into the predictive programming operations that are in play right now. This one is a film that I suggest people have a look at. It's from a very influential and very, I would say, nefarious film studio called A24. This is the trailer for something that came out last summer, called Civil War. And as one can guess, it's all about a civil war in a fictional, not so distant future USA, where a particular Republican president is in their third term. They don't exactly say, you know, they're trying to feign a certain degree of fiction in this, again, predictive programming exercise, masquerading as entertainment. It involves two states, Texas and California, breaking away, declaring their own secessionist movement in their own two-star state. There's another Florida, East Coast secessionist movement also that's sort of suggested is in play in that movie at that time. But basically, it's a world in chaos. So just quickly here, let's just watch the trailer just to internalize the gist of what this creepy movie is.
19 states have seceded.
The United States Army ramps up activity.
The White House issued warnings to the Western forces as well as the Florida Alliance.
The three-term president assures the uprising will be dealt with swiftly.
Let me know if you want to try anything on.
Are you guys aware there's like a pretty huge civil war going on all across America?
We just try to stay out. With what we see on the news, seems like it's for the best.
Citizens of America.
The so-called Western forces of Texas and California
Have suffered a very great defeat at the hands of the United States military.
Mr. President, do you regret the use of airstrikes against American citizens?
We're moving to D.C. today.
We need to go down there.
They shoot journalists on sight in the Capitol. Every instinct in me says this is death.
Flooded.
Every time I survived a war zone, I thought I was sending a warning home. Don't do this. But here we are.
There's some kind of misunderstanding here. What? Well, you're American, okay?
Okay. What kind of American are you? You don't know?
The Western forces will reach the White House on July 4th.
Oh my God.
Get in the car! Get in the car!
Move, move, move!
You're gonna hang back.
I'm not hanging back.
One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Go, 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 go!
God bless America.
As I said, a perfectly disgusting movie. I did watch it, unfortunately, and not unfortunately. I mean, again, it has value. There's insight because you do get into the mind of the enemy when you do take the time to take a deep breath, hold your nose, and watch some of these things. The manipulative quality of it is difficult to. It can't be overstated. Not only is the viewer put into the position of a voyeur, being given a surrogate sort of experience through the eyes of this journalist, this photographer who's just obsessed with getting photographs of historic bloody moments. This one coming home in the U.S. Capitol. But it features basically, it's really catered to anybody who is susceptible to a woke education, who's been processed through the LGBTQ brainwashing Frankfurt School experience. The figures who you're in, I mean, there's that sharpshooter who's killing, U.S. official troops, has pink and light blue nail polish and a little bit of a rave Kool-Aid dye in their hair. There's obviously an idea of dehumanizing those who might be perceived to be conservatives, who might be perhaps inclined to vote Trump, who are seen as or portrayed as ignorant, evil, neo-Nazi killers who just want to kill every foreigner who's not pure blood American born, which does happen quite a bit in this film, to the point that when you get to the end, I'll just say it, I'll just spoil it. Frankly, who cares, right? This is not done for your entertainment. This is yeah, I don't like spoiling movies, but I will here. When they get to that point where the Western secessionist militias have breached the White House with their very sympathetic journalists who are following them around and whom they're keeping protected, right? They're actually protecting. So these Western Antifa style militia groups are actually seen very much so as the heroes because they do things to save the lives of these journalist heroes of the story. When they get to the place where all of a sudden the president is cowering, and this is a president who has been known to have carried out the Antifa massacres of a couple of years earlier. Like I said, they're in their third term, whoever this Republican president might be. They've also atrociously taken down the FBI just a year or two earlier as well. So they're obviously very, very bad, treacherous players in America. Now that the president is at this point hiding under his desk, and his press secretary is outside, a woman who's trying to negotiate with the invaders, saying, "Look, we'll end this peacefully and all." And immediately they just kill her. They just brutally murder this unarmed woman. And by this point in the story, the viewer is actually rooting for the murderers who just killed this unarmed press secretary, and then proceed to go in, track down this president, who they then also brutally execute on the floor of the Oval Office. And again, the feeling that is designed to be created in the heart of the viewer, very cathartically, is one of pleasure out of this disgusting experience. So all that to say, that's a A24, very influential studio. Like I said, I think they're tied to something very nefarious. They do a type of predictive programming and a sophistication of that I've not seen before. I think it's worth examining some of their work. So let's get back onto the current presentation here. Or where did I leave off? Right. So I brought up the evidence of a lot of money involved with paying for people who are willing to put themselves in harm's way in the context of these riots. We know that there are people such as the Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis, who was the U.S. ambassador to Hungary under Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton from 2010 to 2013, who is now and has been the Lieutenant Governor of California from 2019 to present, and is currently also an advisor to the Action, or maybe she was, I don't know if she still is, an advisor to the Action for Democracy Party of Hungary, which was promoted and interfaced very closely with the National Endowment for Democracy. That's a factor to hold in mind. we have also that's one particular NED connection. It's not 100% like smoking gun, but it's a useful data point to keep in mind. We have a woman who has been working closely with Eleni Kounalakis, who is named Karen Bass. And I think many people have probably done a bit of a dive on the background of Karen Bass, but Karen Bass is not just the mayor of Los Angeles, but she's also somebody who had formerly been a congresswoman, during which time she was the former vice chair of the National Endowment for Democracy. She was on the board of directors for a number of years, working closely with Eleni. This oversees, again, $250 million of federal funding for particularly regime change directed operations overseas mostly. There was also a sub-project that she oversaw called the Global Disinformation Index, which was sort of this group that was under her command. It featured a number of operatives, journalists, or CIA figures masquerading as journalists, judging and grading all of the various media outlets out there as being more or less trustworthy on a scale of 1 to 100 or so. And of course, the most trustworthy that came out of this study and are still there on their website are NPR, Associated Press, of course, the New York Times. Those are the good, trustworthy things. The non-trustworthy are pretty much any news outlet that leans conservative. Guaranteed you'll be knocked off the list. And one of the key figures she worked with was Annie Applebaum of The Atlantic, which is owned by the widow of Steve Jobs. That's The Atlantic. She herself is a member of the National Endowment for Democracy. She has worked with Bass. She herself has also promoted regime change and Arab Spring operations funded by Soros and the CIA over many, many years, Annie Applebaum. That includes in Ukraine, that includes, again, Egypt and other things. And so you have some people who are very influential, currently in play in powerful, influential positions in California. We have Gavin Newsom, who has ties to Soros. We have Karen Bass. We have the lieutenant governor of the state. And again, for those who say that this is peaceful, these are peaceful protests, it's nothing of the sort. A lot of masked Antifa-style operations, a lot of foreign flags with iconic photographs being taken. Professional photographers seem to be often employed in these types of operations, featuring things that might make good magazine covers on Time magazine or other things, like that guy over the flames standing on top of a cop car holding a Mexican flag for freedom. This is not peaceful. And it's not just California, like this is starting there, but we have, as of now, plans that are announced for unleashing something much bigger on June 14th, which is the No Kings protest, which is supposed to occur, they say, in 1,500 cities across the United States. This implies a high degree of coordination and planning. Also a high degree of secrecy for this to be able to make it to this point where it's only now that people are paying due attention to it. The idea is for it to coincide with Trump's military parade for the U.S. Army's 250th anniversary and Flag Day. Again, it's very big. This is surprisingly huge. And some of the key figures that we found behind this include these two individuals. You have a former BlackRock managing partner, Morris Pearl, and president of the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten, who are both involved in providing massive support through, again, front groups and NGOs in sponsoring this nationwide protest. You also have a billionaire, what's his name? That's Neville Roy Singham, who founded something known as the Party for Socialism and Liberation. It's a Chicago Maoist billionaire. And this is the type of Gladio Nazi Maoist. I don't think it's the type you would actually find in China. but this is the type that was used by the CIA and by the unreconstructed Nazis that did things like the Weather Underground in the 60s, the FLQ, the Red Brigades, all of these terrorist operations that, Ayers and Bernardine Dorn came out of, who became later on handlers for Barack Obama and company. So the LA riot signs, we know the coordinated printing of those LA riot signs were manufactured by Neville Roy Singham's operations, which also include the Coalition for Humane Immigration Rights, which used to be funded by the Department of Homeland Security and which had its funding cut off when Trump came into office. So there's all sorts of high-level influences that I think are worthwhile people continuing to pull on those threads to see what else comes out of this closet. Here's another picture, and another iconic picture of two Antifa-styled rioters holding flags on a burnt-out cop car. And here's another image of a major riot. Now, people might think that this is Los Angeles. It could be, but actually, it's not. This is Hong Kong in 2019. As a freedom movement, most American conservative Christians were sold this lie, as they were with Tiananmen Square, that the Hong Kong protests of 2019 were all about freedom and democracy and liberation from the evil big bad Chi-Com, as they called them, the Chi-Com supervillains. Well, it was not a peaceful protest for democracy. This was a Western-funded regime change operation to do what did not succeed in 1989 in Hong Kong. And it was very violent. People were lit on fire. Civilians who were against the protesters were lit on fire and died. Metro stations, buildings burnt down. It got violent. Rocks were thrown at cops. It was bad. And just to get across that this is the same thing, that the same enemies that want to destroy the United States are the same enemies that have wanted to destroy China and other countries, that we'll look at a few. I just want to really make this visceral, okay? And I say 2014 and 2019, it's because there were two NED color revolutions that both were subverted by the Chinese government, but were both very dangerous. The 2014 one was known as the Umbrella Revolution. Umbrellas were sort of the unifying motif that brought as a symbolic feature these different riders together. This is just one, and the umbrella served also multiple other purposes, including protecting the identities of people from drone observations, other things like that, as well as just CCTV cameras. And number two, it would also obscure guns, Molotov cocktails, more violent weaponry that would then be hidden from the cops, the police officers, who were not even allowed themselves to be armed at all. They could hold sticks and tear gas, but they couldn't actually. The Chinese police don't carry guns. So it created a certain usefully chaotic situations. Oh, they're allowed to hold plexiglass shields too, right? And that's just an example of some of the riders moving on and attacking the cops. And yeah, it was in that scenario, and the cops doing the same thing inversely. And the idea was you would have those who would throw bricks, Molotov cocktails, try to kill a cop. You'd have evidence, as we saw with Ukraine later on, of protesters also being attacked by shooters that would then be blamed on the cops. And we found also foreign flags, just like we have foreign flags in LA, in this case, Mexican. In the case of China, you had a lot of foreign flags show up, in this case, American, with placards that were spread all over the place. Again, masked, Antifa style, mostly young people assigned to do the heavy lifting and to get a little blood going on their face because they want their paychecks, calling for Donald Trump and the U.S. Congress to pass the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act to come in and to save them militarily from the big bad Chinese. There was this is, by the way, what Nancy Pelosi was promoting and was behind, as well as many neocon freaks in like Lindsey Graham and others were promoting this sort of thing under the idea of extending democracy. Again, this sort of imagery warmed the hearts. And I think everyone can understand why a Christian, conservative-minded person would see this sort of imagery and feel all of a sudden warm, fuzzy feelings inside that, wow, we have real American-loving, freedom-loving Chinese young people out with American flags and pictures of Donald Trump courageously resisting the big bad Chinese government. No, these are, again, Antifa style, violent protesters, left and right. Again, I would say misusing the American flag, as well as the British flag, which is another irony. And I was actually in Hong Kong in 2019 in September for a conference, and I got to see this with my own eyes. Tons of British flags all over the protesters calling for Britain to come in and reacquire Hong Kong as their territorial possession, as it was for 99 years after the Opium Wars. And this was another peculiar aspect of this thing. So again, a lot of evidence of NED, CIA, British MI6 operations. And we see this unfolding, the same playbill. That's Samantha Powers on the bottom left, taking a picture with all of the democracy activists being trained at some Hungarian university. This is the Hungarian color revolution attempt of 2023. It's still a danger. It was suppressed a little bit, but these young people were trained to use social media to put out and project images of peace and happiness, but in reality carry out very aggressive acts of burning down police stations and just doing what you do to try to get a rise. The key is that they want the state to come down violently. They want young people to be sacred sacrifices, right? That's part of what makes this work. So that's Hungary. Again, Samantha Powers, big player in that, as was both Karen Bass, who would have been working with Eleni Kounalis, because, again, Eleni Kounalis was, at the time of Obama and Hillary's oversight of Hungary during her time as ambassador, was also advising a National Endowment for Democracy anti-Orban operation that I mentioned earlier called the Action for Democracy. And again, Karen Bass was very close to that thing too. Ukraine Euromaidan 2014, some pictures, not peaceful protest. This involved neo-Nazis. It involved a variety of operatives who were being funded and supplied all sorts of logistical support and money by people like Victoria Nuland. The ambassador to the United States turned the U.S. embassy in Kiev into a headquarters to organize and coordinate the Euromaidan. It involves, as certain books and researchers have proven already, agencies brought in from Georgia, mercenary groups with neo-Nazi proclivities who are brought in, funded by Western intelligence to shoot at both cops and protesters who were both killed. And basically that's part of the formula. And they were flown out. They were there in Kiev during that most violent aspect of the Maidan. You had the same thing, the National Endowment for Democracy funding the Georgia color revolutions of 2003 and 2023. There's some pictures, and again, foreign flags of the United States and the European Union galore. A lot of masked provocateurs who don't want to be filmed for good reason. Egypt's color revolution 2010 that overthrew Mubarak, who had been trying to work with Gaddafi to create an alternative to the IMF-controlled banking system based on large-scale development projects. He had to be overthrown. The Muslim Brotherhood were the sort of neo-Nazi-styled battering rams that were used where people simply were they just wanted reforms, more economic opportunities, and that's why they were protesting. But then, lo and behold, once a bunch of bodies are in a certain area in Cairo or some other place, all of a sudden, masked groups appear on the scene with AK-47s and guns, and they call for the overthrow of the government. And before you know it, it gets violent fast, and the entire mob gets swept up into the chaos, despite the fact that most people didn't show up in order to do that at all. Before I go on, I'm going to do a little shifting of the gears, and we're going to read an advertisement from today's second sponsor. So we'll do that quickly here, and then get on to the second and last part of today's presentation. So the second sponsor is Pet Club, which I believe I downloaded. If I didn't, I screwed. No, I did download it. Here we are. Pet Club. Experience the miracle of God-given first responder for your health and an ally in your body that fights everything from minor ailments to major health threats. That ally is your immune system. Pet Club 24/7 harnesses the ancient wisdom of nature with their exclusive, potent strain of medicinal mushrooms revered for thousands of years for their immune-supporting properties that are extremely safe, with no additions or overdoses, no side effects, and no interactions with medications. Transform how you manage health with all natural products and help Pet Club change the world one person at a time. Elevate your pet's health and yours with our natural, time-tested solution and explore how we're redefining wellness for both pets and people. Visit badlandsmedia.tv/Pet Club now to explore how they're redefining wellness for both pets and people. That's badlandsmedia.tv/Pet Club, treating pets and their parents better. All right. Let's get back now to the main presentation. All right, so we have a sense now of the international contour of this, right? This is not something new. I left a lot out. There's a lot of other examples: Kyrgyzstan, other nations that have been targeted successfully, some cases unsuccessfully, for regime change. You had the Soros-funded white collar revolution attempt in 2010 or 2011 to overthrow the Putin government. We had the Iran George Soros-funded regime change operations called the Green Revolutions as well, which were suppressed but still are a factor. These governments have pointed out, as Iran has and other nations have, that a major part of what allows for these things to be successful is the presence of, and I'll just say it because it's true, I'm not making this up, Elon Musk's Starlinks, which have been provided for regime change efforts in various governments, including in Venezuela, including in Bolivia, including in Iran, and other places. So that's a that's a thing. That's a uncomfortable fact floating around. I'm just going to put that out there as a thing. Also, I would say the Peter Thiel Palantir operation that I mentioned earlier, Alex Karp, a sociopathic freak who has been a very close, lifelong associate and ally with Peter Thiel. Also, very, very dangerous aspect to what this might involve as part of a game plan. People who have been reading some of my more recent articles on Badlands Substack would know kind of what I'm talking about. So what is generally desired here? Well, just to be clear, I already mentioned this. It's the divide to conquer strategy, right? The idea of balkanizing target countries. By what do? They take different ethnic minority groups, religious minority groups, and then these intelligence agencies will try to work and organize them to become very, very tribal-based, armed organizations with a certain fervent religious-like desire for separation from whatever nation they happen to be a part of, by amplifying and organizing textbooks that feature a narrative of their histories that amplify all of the injustices that had befallen various groups, whether it's the Tibetans, whether it's the Muslims in the west of China, whether it's the Taiwanese people, or the Koreans, or the Inner Mongolian peoples of northern China, or whether it's the Ukrainians or the Georgians. They're given Western-sponsored, recrafted narratives of their own history, both on the one hand, and this is how it works, this is the formula, that overly glorifies some imagined past period of grandeur and greatness, when you might have had the Polish-Lithuania Empire as this great, noble, often hereditarily more endowed super nation, super empire that had been so wronged by a lower, inferior people, a Slavic, a Mongolian people of some sort who were just inferior, who wronged them. And then all of the images of the abuses that the ancestors of the current living people reading these textbooks have suffered is supposed to be relived cathartically in those young people, especially who are often targeted in the school system, to receive sort of a victim identity. They did this again with the younger Ukrainians who were given a story about their past grandeur as a super human race of Nordic warrior Viking types, abused by the inferior Russo-Slav Muscovich peoples who just abused and genocided them again and again and again. And the same thing goes as well for, as I just mentioned, the National Endowment textbooks that have redefined Tibetan history to try to make it seem as though before China came in the 1949-50 period, Tibet was this harmonious land of peace and harmony and brotherhood, and not the actual feudal dictatorship under the Dalai Lama and monk system that had kept the population at a state of squalor with 89% illiteracy, average life expectancy of 31 years of age before 1948. And it was done entirely with, it was a highly abusive black magic kind of esoteric Buddhism that had animated the Tibetan Buddhist sort of society at that time, that Genghis Khan, none other than Genghis Khan, had instituted with the doctrine, with the knowledge or the idea that the Dalai Lama was going to be the spiritual manager of the world government, the world religion that Genghis Khan wanted to rule over, and Khan and his hereditary offspring were going to be the material managers of this forever golden horde empire, advised, of course, by the Venetian high nobility and intelligence like Marco Polo and Marco Polo's father and the other members of the Venetian black nobility that were actually behind the empowerment of the Mongols for centuries, and had used them kind of the way the CIA and MI6 have come to use ISIS as a dark age fanatical battering ram that couldn't exist were they not receiving the intelligence reports, the logistical and financial support by Anglo-American and Zionist intelligence agencies and banking. So that's kind of an uncomfortable, and maybe that could be an entire show unto itself, really. There's been some really wonderful researchers who prove this to be the case very nicely. So all that to say, the idea today is no different from what it was centuries ago when the Mongols were spreading around the world, but is to simply divide and conquer target victim societies up into pieces so that they could better be subdued under some higher agency. And this is, like I said, the image that we see in a lot of Western think tanks of what they believe to be the more natural China, the China being highly reduced in size, with only that tiny bit of red being what they think that the real China should be, as a mostly landlocked civilization. And with like East Turkestan, we mentioned this last week, that many of the Uyghur fighters who have been trained have gotten their head chopping skills mastered as they've been working in Africa, in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, with the support of the CIA, with the support of Turkish intelligence, the Uyghurs, the World Uyghur Congress, which actually has its base not in Xinjiang, not in Turkey, but actually in Germany, which have been providing the support for this thing, which now have a new anti-Chinese army being built up in Syria as we speak, who are being prepared to unleash, to retake back what they believe is East Turkestan, not the province of Xinjiang. We have the same thing in Taiwan, since Taiwan did also suffer a U.S. NED-funded regime change in 2014, at the same year that the Ukraine government under Yanukovych was on the verge of signing a free trade deal with Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. Yanukovych was overthrown because that was unacceptable. And the same thing, too, when the Kuomintang Party of 2014 was finalizing a free trade deal with mainland China, which still is the primary trading partner of Taiwan, which is an autonomous province, not an independent country, but rather a province of one China. When that was being done, that's when the NED went into full damage control by using a lot of useful idiot Taiwanese who had read textbooks in their school about how Taiwan somehow a different culture from the Han Chinese Untermenschen, and they did what was known as the Sunflower Revolution, installing a a U.S. proxy regime in power in Taiwan that canceled this free trade agreement with mainland China, and which is still an issue to this very day, inviting Green Berets to train the Taiwanese military to prepare for military exercises and ultimately to use Taiwan as a disposable tool as a proxy war against China, as they're doing in the Philippines. So another image that we see a lot of in Western think tanks, including in the European Union, Karl von Habsburg, who currently is a European Union parliamentarian. He's the heir of the Habsburg Empire, which is closely affiliated with Steve Bannon. Otto von Habsburg was somebody who ran the Dignitae Humanae Institute, which Steve Bannon became the head of back in 2016 or something. That's Otto von Habsburg. Otto von Habsburg was the prodigy of Coudenhove Kalergi, the godfather of Pan-Europa, the Pan-European fascist movement that would be a bridge towards one world government, but that would only be able to work under a society of highly decentralized micro-ethno-nationalist regimes that would be under the control of jurisdictionally powerful fascist regions. In this case, the European Union being one of several major regions. And this is part of what was known as the Euromaidan, or is known as the Euromaidan operation, tied to the NED, which has been featuring workshops on decolonizing Russia by showcasing what they believe Russia should look like as a society of something like 15 or 16 smaller ethno-national federations. Each ethnic group should get their own country in this logic, and thus be more easy to be managed under things like the IMF, the World Bank, and others. There's a picture of the Libya color revolution. Indian separatist movements too, right? So there's also this is the SRI, another think tank that showcases the different opportunities to inflame micronations to be broken out, carved out of the current India, Jammu Kashmir, Khalistan being another one whose separatist movement is based in Canada. Largely, Uttar Pradesh has another separatist movement. There's a number, as people can see right there. It's pretty wild. So, okay, that's the idea, and that's what they want to do to the United States, and it's not the first time that they've wanted to do this to the United States either. To get this across, this was what the first U.S. Civil War was all about, and if we don't understand that, we won't be able to appreciate how higher strategic thinkers were able to avoid those traps and keep the Union alive, despite all of the efforts to control a radical left and a radical right that had the sole purpose of tearing the Union to shreds in the 1850s and 60s. Both sides were ultimately controlled opposition, much like we see the FBI front groups masquerading as white supremacist, pro-Trump MAGA groups today. There's many of them. Many of them have occult proclivities, right? We've already talked about the Order of the Nine Angles, the Atomwaffen SS groups of right-wing neo-Nazi organizations that have been receiving money from the FBI. That's been proven to be the case now for a number of years. So we know that this is a fact, and we know that the left that we see actually throwing the bricks, trying to hurt and kill police officers who are lighting buildings on fire themselves, the ones carrying out the heavy lifting, are they represent a minority of the left, but a loud one who are being amplified to try to represent the entire voice of the so-called left. Most people, as we've seen in every country subjected to color revolution, do not want to overthrow their governments. They want some form of justice, of reform, but they don't want to generally overthrow their governments. I just realized that I've got a strange headline here. I just realized that my headline still said host of the Pluralia Dialogos, which is another show that I just began on Sundays, every Sunday at 11 a.m. Little side plug there. For those interested, send me a message. I'll tell you how to watch it. It's always a live stream, but today we're not doing that. So I just changed my subheading. So the point being is what they did in the case of the USA in the 19th century was, I would say, a color revolution on a number of levels, modeled in some ways off of the worst abuses of the English Civil War and how that was manipulated by Rosicrucian and occult secret societies. The French Civil War, that as well was manipulated by often Rosicrucian, Martinist secret societies, often with a certain Templar flavor to them. A lot of them with a Stuart Restoration ideology around them that is very much tied to activities associated with Robert the Bruce, who had given sanctuary to many of the occult Baphomet-worshipping Templars who went underground and retreated to different safe havens after 1314, or really after 1307, and were reconstituted in new rebranded forms, of which the Scottish Rite emerged out. A certain takeover of the French Grand Orient Lodge also emerged out of this. So these are things to just hold in mind as factors. So what had happened in the United States? Well, the Civil War didn't just come out of nowhere. What you had was just simply one of many waves that had been created, that had been battering the United States, the fragile young USA, with, I would say, several key moments. And one of the things that the British used to make this work, or to make this anti-American operation function the way it did, was the problem of the discrepancy between the ideals of the Declaration of Independence on the one side, that stated that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, of which include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that was one aspect. But then also the practical reality was there was still an economy addicted to slave labor, and that did not walk the walk. That still recognized the slave in the Constitution as 3/5 of a person, that carried 3/5 of the vote, and that could be owned, bought, bred, traded, sold, or killed without really any legal repercussions, and that were actually protected by the law. And so that created a situation whereby those slave states that had their economy premised around the idea of cheap labor, exporting cheap products, mostly agrarian, mostly cotton products, mostly to England, which was the purchaser of 80% of the slave power cotton, relied entirely on rejecting technology, advanced technology that was seen as anathema to the way of life. It was too disruptive to the genteel, aristocratic way of being of the slave plantation society. And on the other hand, it was also seen as too disruptive because at that point, well, what do you do with your slaves? If you have machines that can do the work of 100 men, then all of a sudden you have all of these useless bodies. What do you do with them? Do you kill them? You clearly think that they're inferior to you genetically. So do you let them go free? Well, you probably think that they're going to want to kill you because you've abused them. So you don't want to do that. So it's really an addiction. And people like Frederick Douglass, the freed slave who became an advisor to Abraham Lincoln, understood this. He became very clear on this issue and made the cogent point, as did Martin Luther King Jr. later on, that the slave master is just as equally a slave as the black slave or the Irish slave or whomever, because they're enslaved to their system. They can't develop their actual human potentialities because of the fact that they are enslaved to the system that they were born into, that demands that they act like little mini tyrants over a community of people who have to have families broken up left and right, who are bred like human cattle. So that even though the slave import market was banned in 1808, so no new slaves could come in, slavery itself was not banned, and humans were bred, again, like cattle, so that a population of 2 million slaves in 1828 grew to 4 million slaves by 1860. That didn't come in through slaves being brought in from Africa. That came from breeding programs. So that's a disgusting thing that the enemies of America were able to capitalize on. And I would say that one aspect of that involved the figure of Aaron Burr, who was a key figure behind both the creation of Wall Street as we know it, the founder of the Bank of Manhattan, while he was the vice president under Thomas Jefferson. Now, Burr was also a very close associate with Prevost. That's it, the Prevost family. And the Prevost family was a very leading Genoese family of Switzerland that ran the committee, or was a leading figure, a leading family within the Committee of 200. And Burr basically married the widow of Augustine Prevost's brother, who was a colonel, another Prevost, who was a co-founder of what became the Charlestown Freemasonic secret policing operation that was overseen by the British Empire, and which organized all of the loyalist military maneuvers inside of the colonies during the American Revolution, and which didn't disappear after 1781. And even though Augustine Prevost's brother did die, that's James Marcus Prevost, he did die, but Burr married his widow, and their operation became the first Scottish Rite Freemasonic agency in America, first in Charlestown, Carolina. So all that to say, this is what Burr was directly brought into. His nephew was the Governor General of Canada, who gave him safe haven sanctuary when he needed to leave the United States for England for 5 years. Why did he do that? Well, because he was caught for the third time overseeing a U.S. secessionist movement to break up the USA. And I say a third time because what happened the first time, he tried to do it and that required that he became president in 1800, which, due to the work of primarily Alexander Hamilton, who fought like hell to make sure that his political rival Thomas Jefferson was elected instead of Burr, which says a lot about Hamilton, such that he, even though he disagreed with Jefferson on so many things, he fought like hell to make sure that Jefferson became president. Why? Because in his words, he made the point that Jefferson has slaves, he's intellectually confused and flawed, but he is not a traitor. Aaron Burr has no principles and is a traitor. And so you cannot tolerate a guy like that to be the president. Now, Aaron Burr's plan at the time, as was outlined by Anton Chaikin, an amazing historian, as well as Gerald Terrien, another amazing friend and historian, Burr's plan was, if he had been successful, to carve out the free non-slave states of the North, and then to undo the U.S. Constitution, allowing the slave states to become their own country, undoing the Constitution, and then join Canada. So the idea would be to integrate the northern free states into British colonial possessions in the North, in what's today Quebec, Ontario, the Maritimes, and become basically part of the British Empire once again. Now, the second time Burr tried to do something like this was in 1804. This failed, but he failed because of Hamilton. However, by 1804, he needed to do it again, and this time he needed to become governor of New York. And New York was sort of the economic engine of the United States at that time. If you could become the governor there, you could get this project to work a second time. He tried, and again, because of Alexander Hamilton once again coming into the play and disrupting Burr's political machinery at Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was sort of the introduction of the most brutal Rosicrucian networks that had infiltrated the Freemasonic lodges. They had organized themselves in Tammany Hall as their Burr machinery base of operations that later on spawned things like the Skull and Bones, like the entire Wall Street apparatus. That was subverted by Hamilton. And so it didn't take long before Burr said, well, we just have to kill Hamilton, which they did, under an arrangement to provoke Hamilton, to get him to act very irresponsibly, emotionally. I think probably flaunting the fact that Aaron Burr oversaw the murder of Hamilton's son, Philip Hamilton, who was a young, talented, brilliant mind who was induced to go into a duel with an associate of Burr, one of Burr's assets, who killed Philip Hamilton in 1802 in New Jersey, on this very same spot that Alexander Hamilton agreed to do a duel with Aaron Burr, using the same guns that were used that resulted in Alexander Hamilton's son dying 2 years earlier at the same spot. So again, I don't think that that was a coincidence. I think that there's a story there. But definitely once Hamilton was dead, a major obstacle was removed from the movement, the deep state that was organized around the Burr machinery, and they tried a third time to get this division, the secession of the United States. And at this time, it required the newly acquired Western territories that had been purchased by Jefferson under the advice of Hamilton in 1804, when Napoleon needed money to carry out his wars. All of these French territories, then called the Louisiana territories, that Napoleon had acquired from his defeat of the Spanish. These were Spanish former to that. He sold for, I think, a few $1 million, maybe 10 million. I'm not too sure, but he sold them for cheap to Jefferson, who bought them. And all of a sudden, you had these new territories. And the fight was then over what is that? What are they going to become? Are they going to become part of a slave empire that will expand, spreading this peculiar institution? Are they going to be part of a free society? What will they be? Will they remain territories, or will they become states? What is it? So this is where Aaron Burr had one of his associates, Colonel Wilkinson, who was himself an agent of the Habsburg Empire. Recently discovered letters have proven that to be the case, as well as the British intelligence apparatus, who was installed as the governor of the Louisiana territories. And part of this new plan, this third attempt to break up the Union, involved Burr organizing with Wilkinson to join up with the British and American mercenaries who would be paid handsomely to join as a paramilitary order to organize in Louisiana and declare war, representing somehow the United States, at least that's how they were portraying it, to declare war on Spain and Mexico and take control of New Orleans, take control of a big chunk of Florida at that time. And then from there, with the new empowered position and organized government, march into Washington, D.C., and depose the president. At the time, Jefferson would have been deposed, probably murdered, and Aaron Burr would have been thus installed as the emperor of the new USA. A civil war probably was planned at that time as part of the product. And the only reason why that failed was primarily because you had Wilkinson, who was discovered to be part of the plan, and he yapped to authorities. You also had a senator who was a whistleblower, who was playing along as though he was a conspirator, participating in these meetings, these conspiratorial meetings at Andrew Jackson's estate, which was the headquarters Aaron Burr had selected. Andrew Jackson was an asset of Aaron Burr, as was Martin Van Buren, a personal lawyer of Aaron Burr, employed directly for Burr in Tammany Hall at the time. And so Andrew Jackson's estate was selected as the headquarters of the conspiracy. And again, one of the senators, whose name I'm forgetting, but he's in my book. If people want to look into it, it's volume 1 of the Clash of the Two Americas, the unfinished symphony edition. They can read the full story there. He blew the whistle, went to Jefferson, and basically said, "Hey, this is happening. There's a coup d'état plot to break up the Union and do something." So there were trials that were conducted on the Burr conspiracy to break up the Union. There was insufficient smoking gun evidence, unfortunately, at that time, such that Burr was acquitted, which is where historians often stop short and they say, "Oh, let's see, he was falsely accused." Well, no, other evidence did show up later on, including direct letters from Anthony Merry, the then British ambassador to the United States, writing to the Foreign Office saying that Aaron Burr has given us his full I'll paraphrase, but we've recruited Aaron Burr successfully, who has devoted himself to the cause of recapturing the United States. And again, people can read that full Anthony Merry quote in my book that I just cited. That was discovered, unfortunately, years later. But then Aaron Burr's behavior becomes very interesting, because after the trial is over, he's so hated by a much more wise, intelligent population that he cannot really live in the USA any longer. So what does he do but leaves to Britain via Canada? And this is where I mentioned earlier, His nephew comes in very handy as the Governor General of Canada, who gives him sanctuary, provides him direct letters of introduction to none other than Jeremy Bentham, Lord Castlereagh, other members of the British high aristocracy, who he then goes and meets and lives with Jeremy Bentham at Jeremy Bentham's mansion in England. Jeremy Bentham, for those who don't know, is not only the author of In Defense of Pederasty, In Defense of Usury, and Against the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Really great human being, that one. But he also is a prolific member of the rebranded Hellfire Club occultists. And Aaron Burr lives with him for 5 years, describing it in his journal as the most rewarding time of his life from 1807 to 1812. So that's where Aaron Burr is living, dropping opium and just living in a daze, working with and hobnobbing with the occult inner sanctum of the British Empire's elite. And then finally is sent back weeks before the War of 1812 is begun. And again, by this point, people have forgotten what Aaron Burr had done. Their attention is now focused on surviving this new precarious war with Britain that's beginning. And Burr is able to then start rebuilding his Tammany Hall machinery. And this is where he's got a letter in 1814 saying, we need to put all of our resources behind getting Andrew Jackson to become modeled as the new hero of America and the new president, who he's the first person to endorse Jackson's call. Because why Jackson plays is, as a prolific drunkard and racist who happily oversees the mass murder of the Cherokee with the Trail of Tears, as well as the creation of the current slave concentration camp system of the First Nations peoples into reservations with the India Act of, I think it's 1828. He's also the biggest nemesis of the Hamiltonian Bank. So even though they killed Hamilton, his banking system and broader system of protective tariffs, internal improvements was not so easy to kill. And it took a number more years for Andrew Jackson to be the guy to finally fulfill that, killing the bank illegally, I should say, and then paying the debt by stopping all internal improvements and ending the protective tariffs of John Quincy Adams, which resulted in immediately the bank panic and collapse of 1837. And then, of course, you have Martin Van Buren, who's continuing on this program for the Burr machinery at this time. So that's also interesting. So I'm just saying all of this to get across that what becomes the War of 1861 to 65 has these precedents. And if we're not aware of them, we won't appreciate what was Henry Clay trying to deal with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. What was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 really all about that allowed for the expansion of slavery into areas that were not supposed to have slavery? What was really going on? And how was this tied to a foreign agency that had nothing to do with America per se? It was not a naturally emergent war from the USA itself. And so for this part of the last section of today's presentation, I'm going to begin with a Russian commentator, an ambassador, Baron de Bruneau, who on January 1st, 1861, wrote an observation of what was going on inside the United States. He stated that the English government, at the bottom of its heart, desired the separation of North America into two republics, which will watch each other jealously and counterbalance one another. Then England, on terms of peace and commerce with both, would have nothing to fear from either, for she would dominate them, restraining them by their rival ambitions. We had many, many wise people back in those days who were on top of an understanding of what was this British system that did not represent the British people. It wasn't even the British government. It was this other thing that was more the direct continuation of the Venetian bankers that had transposed their power structure into Amsterdam and thus into England in 1600 to 1609 into Amsterdam, and then taking their power that they've built up in Amsterdam into England in the 1688 Glorious Revolution and the creation of the Bank of England. That same Venetian Empire and its inner coterie, which also worked very closely with the Genoa and the Genoese occultists that managed the hereditary systems of the high patrician class based then in Switzerland, or a subsection within Switzerland, as a nominal rival but actual ally of the Venetian bankers, were all part of the same patrician class that had overseen the control mechanisms of the Roman Empire that came to power largely over the Roman Civil War that saw Mark Antony and Cleopatra die, that had seen Julius Caesar die, and Emperor Octavius Augustus, who had a certain arrangement with the mystery cults, especially the cult of Mithra, as well as of Isis, but especially of Mithra, that reconstituted Rome from a republic into a full-blown global empire. So again, people today, just to restate, are a lot less familiar with this history that was much more well known by many people, including people like Henry C. Carey, an advisor of Lincoln. Lincoln himself had a deep familiarity with this principle and this process. So they understood that the British were behind this thing. I would also add, too, just as a side note, the Mormons play a very nasty role, because there were 3 other American civil wars before the big Civil War finally struck. And these were initiated by a certain Gnostic religious engineering operation that had been infused into creating a subcult that would be very violent, would have its own paramilitary army, beginning with the first Mormon War in 1838 and continuing until the last of the 3 Mormon Wars in the late 1850s. These were sort of ways to mushify the United States as part of the rendering of the U.S. more malleable and absorbable back into the fold of the British Empire. People know this map of those states that had seceded. There were disputed territories in yellow, the greens being generally those states that were part of the Union. What's less known is that the doctrine of those like Jefferson Davis, like Albert Pike, like the leading figures of the Confederacy, who are all happen to be members of a mixture of the Knights of the Golden Circle, a paramilitary group set up in 1852 that had over 100,000 members strong by the beginning of the Civil War, the beginning phases of the Civil War. The Knights of the Golden Circle, which then transformed themselves into the Ku Klux Klan later on, Ku Klux being the Greek word for circle, as well as the B'nai B'rith. I would say in 1851 was also set up by a lot of the leading figures that we'll find, like the Secretary of State for the Confederacy, Benjamin, I'm forgetting his last name. People can correct me or find that last name if they can. But the Secretary of State for the Confederacy was both a participant, a member of the B'nai B'rith, a Freemasonic offshoot, a variation for organizing as many Jews as possible into a different type of Judaism that would be more constructive for maintaining global empire and chaos operations, and that also interface closely with the Scottish Rite, which had been set up, like I said, in Charlestown, Carolina, South Carolina in 1801, which was tied to the Burr Machine, Tammany Hall, and which largely came out on top after the anti-Masonic movement was petered out in 1840. That anti-Masonic movement saw the destruction of almost every patriotic Republican lodge, and only the Scottish Rite North and South branch seems to have survived. Now, what they wanted, had they been successful at declaring independence and creating their own confederacy, independent of the USA itself, was a Golden Circle empire with Cuba as its new headquarters of this new center, as a sacred sort of island state, not that dissimilar in principle from what the British had seen as their island empire designed to rule the world, or what they convinced Emperor Hirohito to see Japan as an island empire endowed by a superior race, endowed to lord over the slave colonies of the world in some weird utopian fantasy land. So that's sort of what they had crafted for them as well. That would involve capturing and spreading the slave system through most of that area we see there on the map. And again, leading up to and making this Civil War possible, I've already alluded to some of it. And we had 2 Freemasonic agencies who were organizing together to split the Union. You had during the Civil War, you had the pro-Confederate bushwhackers versus the pro-Union Jayhawkers, as they called themselves. And that meant during the Civil War, cross-border raids, there was committing of the acts of violence against civilians and soldiers. There's one case of 130 civilians being massacred over the course of one evening in one of these cross-border raids by these terrorists from both sides. Both sides. The pro-Union Jayhawker terrorists would go and run into and carry out massacres of Confederate families, and inversely, the same thing was done against the families of parts of the states that were still in the Union. Kind of similar to what was done by the British overseeing both massacres of Arabs in Palestine, as well as Jews, using their assets like Haj Amin, who was then in charge of, or is a major player running the Muslim Brotherhood terrorist operations, as well as Ord Wingate, the British Plymouth Brethren fanatic who was in charge of the Irgun, which was also and is still today known as one of the co-founders of the IDL, the Israeli Defense Forces, I should say, the IDF, that would then carry out murders of innocent civilians of the Arab world, and the Arab world carrying out, or the sects within the Arab world, terrorists would then carry out massacres of Jews, and that's the way that they work. They did the same thing in the 30 Years' War of acts of Protestant terrorism against Catholic families, and then Catholics being represented by certain Jesuit operatives who would then masquerade as representing the entire Catholic people, killing Protestant families, and they would just create this eye for an eye, transgenerational revangism, and they always do that. The Young America North and the Young America South. So both of the Carlisle, Mazzini, Young Europe operations had big penetrations into the United States. As I mentioned earlier, part of what makes color revolutions work is that narratives are crafted to brainwash young people around some past grandeur that makes them more tribal, makes them more prideful, makes them more violent, and that makes them feel more victimized by some other force next to them, usually. Right? That victim identity becomes easily violence prone, as we've seen with Antifa and people who've been given the 1619 remaking of their history, who have been induced to try to declare war on the entirety of white systemic racism per se by lighting cities on fire, as we saw in the wake of the George Floyd riots, or that we're likely going to be seeing more of now. So again, this is not a new thing. The Young American North was introduced and led by the founder of Transcendentalism, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote a whole tract on Young America, calling for young people who are naturally wise because they are young to break off the shackles of tradition and the belief that the Constitution should be something respected, and instead build a new type of society founded upon complete individualism that has nothing to do with the Constitution or America's outdated traditions. So you had, on the one hand, this type of Young America of the North. Emerson himself, by the way, being an asset of Caleb Cushing, who lived from 1800 to 1879. And Caleb Cushing is somebody who a whole class should be done on. Again, Anton Chaikin's Treason in America is one of the best overviews of Caleb Cushing as a top leader of the American deep state and asset of the British Empire in America, who also trained Albert Pike, who became a leading Confederate general and later founder of the KKK, the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, as well as William Lloyd Garrison, the leader of the abolitionists, who was also a devotee and prodigy of Caleb Cushing. So you have these strange, how could these individuals both train leading people who would go on to run the abolitionist movement on the one hand of the North, as well as the leading secessionist movement of the South, right? Who the hell is Caleb Cushing? Again, we could do a whole class on this in the future. But what I can say is that the encouragement of terrorist actions to fight slavery by shooting up Harper's Ferry, that was done by John Brown, was made possible because of this type of operation being set into motion. The George Saunders, who, by the way, George Saunders was a member of the Franklin Pierce administration of 1850s. Saunders was the American consul to England, where he interfaced very closely with Giuseppe Mazzini and Lord Palmerston at that time, being the patron of international anarchist movements and having even anarchist salons at the American consulate in England at that time. So he was known as the American Mazzini, George Saunders, who went on to be installed in Canada during the Civil War, overseeing Confederate intelligence operations with Thompson that carried out terrorist raids, the Albany raids. Even the murder of Lincoln himself was made possible and coordinated through Confederate operations in Canada, overseen by George Saunders. So again, left and right dichotomy, right? William Lloyd Garrison, this is the person who became the voice and the face of the abolitionist movement, which was an enemy of Lincoln. As much as Albert Pike was an enemy of Lincoln, so too were these radical abolitionists and what are known as the Copperheads, the Copperhead Democrats that often represented the biggest or were funded by the biggest financial money bags of New York at the time, like August Belmont, the Rothschild official representative in America, who were just basically saying, let's just let the Confederates have their own country. We'll have our own smaller, reduced country. We'll join up with Canada. We'll have a new constitution that's going to be pro-British, pro-free trade. The Confederates are going to have their own constitution under their own confederacy that's going to be pro-British, pro-free trade. And in fact, in the Confederate Constitution, it illegalizes protective tariffs. It also illegalizes the idea of forever being allowed to free any slave or pass a law that frees a slave. That's part of the Confederate Constitution. Just putting it out there too, for those who say the Confederacy was were the victims of that spat and Lincoln was the bad guy and the Confederates were just going to naturally dissolve slavery in time if we were just more patient. Not true. It's in their Constitution. Slavery is perpetual. Free trade and the abolishment of protective tariffs are perpetual. The illegalization of the national involvement in directing credit towards internal improvements was enshrined in the Confederate Constitution. And the entirety, I would say, of the entire Civil War was funded by the British. The only thing that saved the United States, in fact, was primarily Lincoln's understanding of the higher principles of Hamiltonian economics, which he applied in the form of his greenbacks, of his reorganization of the banking system, and also Russia's involvement in saving the Union at this precarious moment. I'll add here as well, the Scottish Rite and the Scottish Rite Northern jurisdiction versus the Scottish Rite Southern jurisdiction, both were part of the same scheme. Both were under the control of the United Grand Lodge of England. I mentioned already the Copperhead Democrats, the Wall Street Boston Brahmins versus the Slave Power Confeds, false opposition. And the common theme, like I said, abolished constitution, established two new pro-British, pro-free trade confederacies who would hate each other, as the Russian ambassador had correctly noted. The two dominant figures that Anton Chaikin beautifully illustrates in his Treason in America. If anybody could find this book, buy the book. Even if you have to pay more money, it's a bit expensive, buy the book. You could probably get it for free online on archive.org too. Just get the book and read the book, right? Just do that, please. But so Anton Chaikin, 1987, he writes this book, and I'm just going to quote from a small part of it. On the left is J.J. Gurgas, and on the right is Albert Pike. And he's talking about the Knights of the Golden Circle, which both men from representing the North and the South of Freemasonry are working together. And we see them both in their Freemasonic regalia, representing the 33rd degree, and of the Scottish Rite. And I think that there's probably parallel rites within the Scottish Rite that are not the same thing, just to say, because I've met some people who are pretty high up in the Rite, in the Scottish Rite, and they're not bad people. But in my evaluation, what I'm gleaning here is that there's parallel degrees, one esoteric, one exoteric, even for those who are apparently being initiated. And it seems to be that similar tests are given that might be answered totally differently, where one person kills the rabbit, the other person doesn't kill the rabbit, and both people think that they've done the right thing from their superior, and they're both told that they can go to the next degree. But now because of how they responded, what those degrees are going forward are going to be a totally different set of experiences, and what both individuals are going to see as functions for themselves as players within systems that they may not even fully understand are going to be totally different because of how they morally responded. So that's just something I'm just noticing in my research so far on the occult. But now Anton Chaikin says, while the Knights of the Golden Circle, the military organization of the Confederacy, was being organized under the control of the Scottish Rite's northern chief, the Swiss JJJ Gurgas, and his lieutenant Kilian Henry van Rensselaer, the southern jurisdiction of the Rite was organizing the political leadership for the secessionist itself, or the secession itself. The man in charge of this project was Albert Pike of Newburyport, Massachusetts. Pike had been a lifelong friend and a decades-long protege of his townsman, Caleb Cushing. On March 20th, 1853, 2 weeks after Cushing rose to power as the Attorney General of the United States, the Rite's Southern Secretary General Albert Gallatin Mackay conferred the Rite's exalted degrees upon Albert Pike at a ceremony in Charleston, South Carolina. In 1859, Albert Pike was called upon to become the Grand Commander of the Southern Scottish Rite. The gap Pike was to fill came from the sudden death in 1858 of Mississippi secessionist and Scottish Rite leader John A. Quitman. Over the next 2 years, until the records suddenly stop a week before Fort Sumter was attacked, Pike set up a Scottish Rite Supreme Council extending for the first time over the entirety of the South. And again, anybody trying to carry out a serious inquiry into the Civil War and its causes while ignoring the role of Freemasonry is going to be doing a very half-assed job. Breaking history. And that's unfortunate that there's this whole idea that conspiracy theorizing should disqualify one from expected in any type of polite society or in academia. And that's a very dangerous logic, which has kept a lot of people from making proper discoveries about what's actually going on causally in their past, let alone what is actually animating their current present. And I'll just end with the last two slides here. Lord Palmerston stated to August Belmont during the Civil War that we do not like slavery, but we want cotton, and we dislike very much your moral tariff. This is, of course, a reference to the tariff of 1861, which was made possible once the Confederates left the Union, and all of a sudden this tariff could pass. It was not facing the kind of resistance it had been formerly. And with that, Lincoln was able to organize America's steel, America's industry, that allowed it to start actually producing things again for the first time in many years. The U.S. only had 42 ships at the beginning of the Civil War. By the end of the Civil War, it had 670 major ships, major vessels, 22 of which were Monitor-class warships. You had also an organization of a proper industrial base, which was made possible by the protective tariff. You also had, at the same time, through Hamiltonian economics taught to Lincoln through the figure of his advisor, Henry C. Carey, you had the idea of national banking procedures, where at the beginning of the Civil War, there was something like 14,000 different, 1,400 different currency notes, banknotes in existence. There were about 1,500 banks, but 5,500 counterfeit different types of notes. Counterfeit notes were everywhere. So there was, every bank could issue their own notes. There was no organized national currency or regulatory regime. There was no protective policy. And so nobody wanted to invest in the USA. The US was a speculative basket case of economic irrationalism. So that had to be corrected. And it was done through a series of bank acts, the National Currency Acts of 1861, 62, 63, the National Bank Act of 1864, that allowed for federal supervision, the forced reserve requirements. So for the first time, there had to be reserve requirements in every bank if it was going to be a bank. Its directors had to reside dominantly in the state that they were running the bank. They all had to be American. All banks had to be, you couldn't carry out usury in the banking system. That was illegalized. Any bank that tried to do usury, that was irrationally high interest on loans, would be punished and would have to give back 2 times the amount that they were trying to steal from their customer. Greenbacks were issued as well by 1862 or 63. Lincoln began to issue greenbacks, which became $500 million of currency. The banks, if they wanted a charter, they had to put a third of their capital into the treasury itself. So the banks were induced to lend to the government that then could then give them currency notes, greenback notes back that could then circulate in money form. You had 520 bonds that would mature in 5 to 20 years, which was very important and an innovation of the industrial pro-Lincoln banker Jay Cooke, which involved the U.S. citizen financing the Civil War by buying patriotic bonds. And these became $1.2 billion issued that were then used to finance not just the war and the supplying of the troops, but also things like the Transcontinental Railway, the industrial canal projects, and other projects that were internally improvement based on an idea of building a better society with a long-term vision for the future. The Confederacy didn't have any of that. They could only exist by massive infusions of capital from England, which had all sorts of ways through the Caribbeans, as well as just blockade runners that would provide weapons, logistical support to the Confederacy. Much of the Confederacy's munitions were being supplied by British-made weaponry, food as well, massively supplied by the British, as well as warships like the SS Alabama, but many others were being produced by London, which was then providing the means for the Confederacy to continue its war on the Union. Sorry. And so all of these things were different ways, and only the Russian involvement directly through the sanctioning by Alexander II was enough to shift the tables in favor of the Union, by the British and the French receiving the message that if you go in and openly militarily now do what you're covertly doing, but if you declare war on the Union and the side of the Confederacy, that will be open war with Russia. And those European countries were not prepared to take that risk at that time. They didn't feel like it was a worthwhile gamble. So that kept them out of the war on that more full frontal basis. And I'll just end here with a last quote by Lord Gascoigne Cecil, otherwise known as the Marquis of Salisbury, who, as a member of Parliament, later became Prime Minister 3 times, stated that the northern states of America never can be our true friends, our sure friends, because we are rivals politically, rivals commercially. With the southern states, the case is entirely reversed. The population are an agricultural people. They furnish the raw material of our industry, and they consume the products which we manufacture from it. With them, every interest must lead to cultivate friendly relations. And when the war began, they at once recurred to England as their natural ally. So, just to get across, I hope people really internalized this message in any degree I can. The thing that allowed America to survive was that there were people who were in leadership who decided to take responsibility, people like Frederick Douglass, Henry C. Carey, Lincoln, many others, both in America and abroad, who took responsibility for their society based upon their understanding that their knowledge that they had earned through hard mind work and study and passion gave them a power to act that was lacking in the leadership that was otherwise being provided as puppets to the population to pick from. They didn't fall for these left versus right traps. Frederick Douglass broke from William Lloyd Garrison. And Frederick Douglass, when he realized that William Lloyd Garrison was calling for the destruction of the Constitution, he said, well, wait a minute. Why have I never read the Constitution? And he sat down and he began studying it. And then he realized that the provisions for ending slavery were actually embedded perfectly inside of that very Constitution that had flaws, 3/5 clause being just one of it's a bad flaw. But the principles that would provide the legal groundwork to properly destroy slavery were enshrined also within that very Constitution, which he then became a defender of. He rose to become a supporter of Lincoln. He met with Lincoln and became a leading advisor, and later on became an ambassador to Haiti. that Frederick Douglass he broke with Garrison early on when he realized how this trap was being set. Lincoln also had to do battle with both radical abolitionists as well as radical slave powers. He had to do battle with both, as well as Canadians. Not the Canadian people, but there was this other thing in the Canadian intelligentsia that's tied to the Jesuit and Anglican high command, which was and still is, I would say, antagonistic to the very idea of what America stands for. But he had allies who were able to also rise to the occasion, of which Alexander II was a leading figure, but there were many others in France, in Germany, around Bismarck, around Sidi Carnot, the president of France, around many others, and even as far as India and in China and in a lot of Latin American countries. Benito Juarez, the president of Mexico, was a close friend and ally of Lincoln during that same time of American Civil War, where Mexico had their own civil war. And I would also say at this very same time that same civil war run by the same oligarchical factions that are still trying to carve up the world today were also behind organizing the civil war in China, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom Rebellion that was happening for 15 years from the 1850s to 1860s, which also overlapped the Opium Wars. But that was an internal civil war that China had to deal with an agency, an individual who went through a weird mystical experience and through being trained by Jesuit missionaries, discovered that he was the brother of Jesus reincarnated, and led this, what he called the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, in a bloody 15-year war, representing like 30 million Chinese at the time who were induced to go and fight with him against the Chinese government, with the British threatening to provide their full support to the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom if the Chinese government didn't fully submit to British demands for full control over things like Hong Kong, Shanghai, pretty much all the concessions that would give Britain control of the Chinese economy for another 100 years. So that was something that was part of the same type of game plan. They did the same thing with the Bolshevik Revolution as well. They had done something similar but different with the Crimean War against Russia, that was less internal and more foreign directed as a trap. But the Bolshevik Revolution was, again, very, very similar, funded by Wall Street and City of London tycoons and occultists trying to work to basically subdue and break up Russia as a civilizational entity and make it more malleable, manageable under the control of Trotsky primarily, and a bunch of Russian occultists that had an idea of ushering in the end times. Let's just say it that way. So that's not all that different from the types of ideas that are still active in our current battle for humanity right now. There's a lot of very bad ideas and, unfortunately, a lot of ignorance about what's really shaping our world. So I think I'll end it there. I'm just going to scroll through very, very briefly the comment section, which I have not been paying attention to. And I'm very sorry that when I'm going solo, I can't pay attention to the comment section. But I did notice, just in a quick scroll up here, that Eleanor 2000 gave $20 and said, "Matt, this is incredible information. Thank you so very much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us." You're welcome, Eleanor. That's I'm very glad that you liked it. Just scrolling down a little bit more right now to see if there's anything else big that I missed. Somebody just wrote, Burr's parents died when he was 1 or 2 years old. Sure didn't have normal upbringing. Just Googled it. He was born in Newark, New Jersey. Yeah, and his grandfather, Jonathan Edwards, very important guy to look into as well, who oversaw was one of the key players who oversaw, I guess it was the Second Great Awakening in America, that basically brought in occult spiritualist techniques of channeling and ghost rappings and things like that, and basically were designed to take Christianity and turn it into an operation to make people crazy through very, very over-the-top revivalist meetings that really, I think, weakened the mental, moral fortitude of the population, which nearly undid the foundations of what became the American Revolution. But this is the guy who trained Burr directly after his parents died. And again, Anton Chaikin, in his book, goes through this in immense detail. I really, really recommend people pick up Anton Chaikin's book for that purpose. Just quickly going through here. The Ritz writes Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, Knights of Malta, Knights Columbus, Catholic Church, Knights Golden Circle equals henchmen. Yes, that is true. I agree. They're all different sort of flavors of the same thing. The Ritz also noted that Mormons are a sneaky problem in our country. Think of Romney, Harry Reid, etc. You got no idea. Yeah, that's there's a lot to that. Yeah. So yeah, I can't really quite. I thought I could just scan through, but I'm not going to be good at this. So we'll do a better job at the comments section next week when Gord's back with us. And until then, I wish you all a good evening, good night, good morning, wherever you are, and I'll see you all again next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.